To this eve of Halloween. Thanks for joining us this bi-monthly, I guess that's how you say it, bi-monthly or every other week we have this meeting. My name's Dan Clark. I'm the director of the Local Government Center. For those of you that do not know me, we host this in partnership with the Montana Association of Counties. And we're happy to have some of their staff. We got Eric and Jason on board, as well as Chantel. There she is. So I don't know if you've got any other MACo staff on. That's all I can see. But we're grateful that you're able to join us, that you are finding this valuable of an exchange. So we're hopeful that we can get through some material. We've got this scheduled for an hour. If it doesn't take a full hour, we'll sign off early. But we want to make sure that we cover these topics and that you'll get your questions answered. So welcome. Thanks for joining. We're up to 49 folks now. That's good. And I think what we'll do is just go ahead and turn the time over to Eric and Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Clark, and thank you all for joining us again and participating in these conversations. I still find these valuable, and if you don't, please let us know, and we'll either make modifications to them or stop them. But we're still getting good attendance, and I still think we're passing on good information. And from your staff's perspective, the conversations that we have here really do help us in advocating with the governor's budget office and making sure that we do as good of a job as we can in trying to get CARES Act eligible expenses based on your guys' request. And I hope you find the same true, that when we talk about things that you might not have thought of, that it provides you with an opportunity to seek reimbursement for CARES Act eligible expenses that without these conversations we might not have thought of. I'll let Jason talk about those in detail, but I want to start with a more boring update on the conversations that we've been having internally with the auditing community and with the state in terms of the allowable use of CARES Act funding as it comes back into your counties. I think we have a significant breakthrough this week. And that significant breakthrough is that I think finally the state has clarified their position, and at least one of the large auditing firms in the state has agreed with our position that these monies coming back in are unrestricted. So let's talk about that for a second. The Local Government Services Bureau early on in this pandemic suggested that counties created a restricted revenue account to account for these federal dollars coming back in. It was the state itself that set this up as a reimbursement program. The federal government did not set CARES up as a reimbursement program. Nor did the federal government set this up, the CARES Act distribution of money, as a grant. So one of the things Chantel sent out as a reminder for this meeting today was a discussion that the Treasury posted on their frequently asked questions document in their memo form that further clarifies receipt of CARES Act funding is not grant funding. Unambiguously so. These are not grant dollars in the term that we normally think of grant dollars. There's not letters of application. There's not grant award letters that come. Although the money is still subject to audit requirements and Single Audit Act compliance requirements, these are not grant funds. The State Department of Administration and Local Government Services Bureau agrees with that now. And I think the most substantial thing that we got from them in clarifying our conversations this week is that the state and auditors should now recognize that these are one-time unanticipated federal revenues. How you account for those, I still am asking that you work with your independent auditors. There's still some discussion about whether you'd have to track this money coming in the last fiscal year on an accrual basis. I think there's consistency that you don't have to do that for the current fiscal year. But ultimately, as those monies come in, if you've set up that restricted revenue account that the Department of Administration suggested that you set up, that's to track the money coming in so they can comply with audit compliance and that you can show that that money came in based on the justified expenditures that you submitted to the state to receive that money. After that, get it where you want. So the statement that we got, the reason I'm excited about this is the statement that we got from Local Government Services Bureau is that it's ultimately up to the local governing body where that money goes. If you want to transfer it to your public safety fund, because a big chunk of it came from your law enforcement personnel costs, Board of County Commissioners have the discretion to do that. If you want to transfer it to your general fund so you can use it for general governmental purposes, the Board of County Commissioners has the discretion to do that. How you use this money as it comes back in is going to be at the discretion of the governing bodies, i.e. your Board of County Commissioners. They're not restricted. They're not limited based on the expenditure fund. They come in through with that federal identifier, and that you can get them into your general fund. Check with your auditors to make sure that they're on the same page that we're on now. And if we still have to have conversations internally with local government services bureau and the audit community, the state's willing to have those conversations. They don't see it as an issue anymore. I hope the auditing community doesn't see it as an issue anymore. And ultimately, what we're trying to avoid is those internal fights that you might have with elected officials about whose money it is. You guys get to decide that. The Board of County Commissioners they are the entity responsible for the financial transaction. Budget amendment processes, if you want to spend this money right now and it was unanticipated. If you do transfer it to specialty funds like your public safety funds, make sure that you do the best job you can to stay in compliance in terms of your excess cash carryover, and that you're not getting audit findings for holding more cash than you're allowed to. All those things we can help you work through. But ultimately, these are, as they come back into your coffers, these are general governmental funds to be used for general governmental purposes. So if you didn't get a chance to see Chantel's update, the Treasury guidance has a link. It's embedded in I think the sentence that says U.S. Treasury. You can find the full 15 pages of guidance, but we've highlighted and cut out the portions of it that you can share with your auditors that say clearly these aren't grant dollars. They are not grant dollars. And technically, they're not reimbursement dollars either. So they're coming back in for you guys to use for general governmental purposes. I'd answer any questions about this before I turn it over to Jason for an update on allowable expenses.
Eric, we had one question come in. Which firm has agreed with your position?
I was fortunate enough to invite myself onto a call with Lewis and Clark County and their auditing firm. It was AZ, who I think holds contracts with a vast majority of the urban counties. Ulnus has been in contact with the Department of Administration Local Government Services Bureau, and we were told yesterday that Ulnus now agrees that those should be unrestricted funds too. I don't have confirmation of that, but I trust Cheryl Gray when she said those conversations have been had.
Looks like Mark McGinley has a thought.
Yeah, Eric, we have our auditors in the office all week, or we've been working with them. And I've been bringing this concern up. And he told me basically on our part how to get around what you're talking about. But he still claims that the money goes into the 2990. He wants us to move the expenses from the sheriff's office into that fund to spend them out of that fund, which relieves a bunch of money in the sheriff's department that we can put into the CIP. That's how we're, that's what we've sort of agreed on to today. That way there's accounting, there'll be no finding on that, and it gets to where we want to be. Is that a good, safe way to do it?
Commissioner, that is a good, safe way to do it. And we haven't suggested that as the path for all local governments, because it is a process to transfer all of your known and unknown CARES expenses into a made up new fund to be able to essentially debit what's coming back in. If you're willing to do that and you want to do that from a transaction perspective, that makes a lot of sense. But you don't have to do that. That's why I'm still suggesting you all get with your auditors to see what they want. For them, what it means is they can match up your reimbursement requests with the money coming in, and that's what they want, audit compliance. And it does provide you the flexibility to get the money where you need to. So that's a good system, but it shouldn't be required.
Okay, well, that's because I did just show him Chantel's notes that you just sent out. And he agrees, right down to that last statement. He says where I think it says these are unrestricted funds, and they still don't agree with that, and that's how he says you can get around it. But that's what we're doing in our county, it sounds like. So I'm tickled.
Is he, Mike, since you asked, is he making you do budget amendments too?
No, because I sort of planned on this money coming in, so we put it in the budget when we did it this year.
Okay.
We went through the process of last June did the resolutions to create these new CIPs. knowing the money was coming, but we didn't ask for any in until it come to July. So they're moving money, ever how auditors do that from last year expenses. But we're cool here in Beaver County, and that's how I guess we're pulling it off is we're moving the expenses into 2990, spending it there, then we can, comes out the same.
Well, for the membership, that makes sense. And also the fact that he had built in an expected contribution into capital improvement ultimately proves my point that these are unrestricted revenues. You're going to be able to put them in and save them for one-time expenditures, which from a financial planning perspective makes a lot of sense.
Eric, if we jump back over to the chat, there was a comment, the GASB Tech Bulletin 2020-1 provides good guidance for reporting. And then another question that came in, can a county leave the funds in the 2990 account until the end of the fiscal year and distribute it at one time?
Yes. In fact, that's been our guidance up to this point because we didn't want you to get audit findings for transferring it into specific areas that might have had excess cash. But ultimately, yes, you can hold this money in that fund until you make a decision on what you want to do with it. And one of the things AZ said is that they issued some previous guidance about allocating CARES Act reimbursement money to special funds, for example, public safety. They said that they're going to reach back to their membership and allow a process that looks like essentially an error correction. It's not a transfer back out with all that from a restricted fund for which all that process has to be accounted for. They're going to issue an opinion that they, in error, suggested that the money be going to those restricted accounts and now allow them to transfer back out. So there's more information coming, which should free up some flexibility for anybody that accidentally followed the auditor's guidance when the auditors weren't entirely correct.
All right, I think that catches us up for now.
Let's throw it over to Jason. He's got some good updates.
Okay, a couple quick things. Eric, you have that GASB guidance in your inbox. I tried to skim it while I was listening, and I think in the end they come back around to what you're hearing, Mike. That's our sort of the last thing we don't agree on piece of the puzzle.
Jason?
Yep.
When can I share my opinion about GASB?
Right now.
So I'm going to give it to you in a nutshell. It is a private club sitting somewhere in New Hampshire, I think, that issues edicts on high and has no idea what it means to, in the real world, to allocate resources and manage public funds.
So what we run into is we have the Treasury guidance, right, that we read and we try to follow, and then it comes down, the money goes to the state, and so they can add their layer of rules to it because they have the purse strings, right? And one of the things they've added is for their protection, they've turned it into a reimbursement program, but it's simply for their protection for their audit purposes, not for yours. And the combination of the money coming from the feds looks like a grant, smells like a grant, then it goes to the state and they turn it into a reimbursement program, which makes it look even more like it, but it's not either one of those things. The auditors through GASB can't wrap their head around that. We can. It's frustrating. So, and GASB is not a government agency. It's Eric's private club, and he called him that on a phone call. Moving on, public health. A good number of you or all of you have got additional grant funds directly allocated to your public health departments. So back to the original guidance that we had with future reimbursements, don't make sure you don't double dip. My recommendation to you is that you reach out to them and tell them to concentrate their money on direct costs, so additional protective devices, etc., and keep the money freed up for presumptive salaries to be used through CARES. But I was asked to give a heads up that we don't double dip those funds that were sent out again. Also on the line of public health, we've had a couple of counties that have basically diverted their entire public health staff to COVID-related mitigation and activities. The presumptive folks are your public health nurses and your public health officers. If you have administrative staff, finance, front desk, those sorts of staff, that their titles are not going to be readily, easily identifiable as frontline workers, what you need to submit either on the front end, I would recommend, is a certification that you have diverted those staff and that they're spending 2/3 or more of their time on COVID related mitigation and response. So in regard to public health, we don't have to track the timesheets. We got them to give us a little bit of leeway there because of the nature of that department. But they will request a certification that any staff that has a title that isn't public health officer or nurse, that you certify that they're being used for a substantially dedicated amount of time, 2/3, towards COVID. So my recommendation is get that in with your request in advance. If you don't, they will ask for it. With regard to other departments, that same rule may not apply. So if you have folks in your sheriff's department that you think are doing COVID response that are not sworn officers, be tracking their timesheets, and we'll have to submit those separately. I'll keep working on them to see if we can get a little bit more latitude, but we haven't quite got there with the other departments. Ambulances. We've had some pretty good luck recently with some pre-approval requests for equipment related to your ambulances. So chest compression devices, defibrillators, loading systems, stair chairs, those sorts of things. We've been getting some approvals. So for those of you that have county run and owned ambulance services, be talking to your EMS folks about whether or not they need to either get those types of equipment or if they're outdated and need to be updated because of COVID. We had one come in that they had machines that just couldn't keep up with the trauma related to a COVID patient and they need to upgrade. And so they put in a request. They didn't know they didn't have the right equipment, but they found out the hard way. So be talking to your EMS folks, get those to me for pre-approval. We've had some pretty good luck with those. December 30th, we're every day getting closer to that. For those of you that are doing pre-approvals and buying equipment on those pre-approvals or asking for them, they have to be bought, paid for, and in use, implemented by December 30th. That's a hard deadline. The folks at the state are getting more assertive in reminding us of that and saying we will not pay if we don't have proof and documentation that it was in use by December 30th. So I don't want any of you counties to get stuck holding an invoice because we didn't get a piece of equipment in play or a computer in play or a piece of software in play by December 30th. So please, as you work with your vendors on those pre-approved requests, make sure that you build in some safeguards to get those in place. For those of you that are waiting to hear back on your last request, be patient. As of yesterday, they had about 23 million out the door on this last request series. They have about 70 million still left. So they got quite a ways to go. And I anticipate that may impact when they open up the next cycle. I think we were anticipating a November 5th date for the next submittal opening. They haven't changed it yet, but my gut tells me that given that they still have $70 million to get out by the end of next week, that they may ask for a little bit of an extension on that. And we will let you know if they do. Otherwise, we do know that most likely your deadline is for submittal. The cutoff date will be the end of this month or tomorrow. So you can begin preparing your submittal, but I'm not sure when they'll open the portal. Also, in the last couple of meetings, I've sort of encouraged you all to submit anything you can think of that you thought was CARES related, which has been great. But what I want to amend my ask just a little bit and encourage you that when you submit those, if you could really help me build the nexus between your request and CARES and COVID, namely COVID mitigation and response, that's very helpful. I've gone back to some of you and asked for additional information, and that's worked. But when we walk in there, they do scrutinize us pretty hard. So if you can help me at the local level understand why you feel there's a nexus, then I can carry that argument into the room and hopefully win. So if you can build that up front, that's very helpful. Also had a couple of follow-up questions on leave. So still at this time, the state is not approving any kind of leave. No, they're not going to reimburse administrative leave. They're not going to reimburse vacation, sick time, bereavement, any kind of leave, sick leave. It's not going to be reimbursable. I had a couple of those get denied, and folks didn't expect that it would get denied. So I just want to be really clear that none of those leave costs are reimbursable. They will be taken out if you ask for them. What I miss, Eric? Anything?
No, I think that covers it. Let's see if we get some questions.
Questions?
I had a question come in. It says, Jason, could you give your thoughts on paying exempt health department management employees additional pay for extended hours of work, similar to bonus pay or extra pay type, and then overtime ?
Are they salary or hourly?
It says exempt, so I'm thinking
Yeah, they're salary.
salary.
So if they're salary, that makes things more complicated. We've been trying to work one-on-one with counties that have brought this forward, and I know Eric was working on some guidance. I'm not sure where that's at. If they're contract employees, you can work on amending the contract. If they're actual county employees, it gets a little bit tricky, because if you increase their pay for this, you may be increasing it forever. And I don't know, do we have Mackenzie on from a personnel standpoint?
I'm here.
So there's some pitfalls related to doing this that we're trying to find solutions for, but we're doing them in a one-on-one type situation. And I'm not sure where that question came from, but we'd be happy to reach out.
I will give you some info on that, Jason. We have another question that came in. Why is leave still disallowed when Treasury guidance on September 2nd specifically states covered benefits include, but are not limited to, the cost of all types of leave?
So this goes back to what I said about, we have Treasury guidance, which sets up one set of rules from the federal level. But the reality is the dollars drop into the state's coffers, and they have the latitude to make additional rules. There's, he who holds the gold makes the rules. That's the case on this. The governor's office has determined that reimbursing local governments for time for folks that are on vacation or other types of leave, philosophically, they just took issue with that and flat out just said, no, they're not going to pay it.
So in terms of our negotiations with the state, this has been the one, this has been the most difficult of the conversations that we've had. And as a result, we went to the mats on this one with them, and they wouldn't concede, they wouldn't give up, and they wouldn't change their opinion. As a result of that, I generally no longer speak in the meetings with the governor's budget office, and we let Jason carry all the requests forward. So the truth be told, they didn't give us this, but because they didn't give us this and we threw such a fit about it, and Jason has gotten a lot of other requests that probably would have been marginal and borderline at best.
Yeah. So the other example of them sort of pinching the rules is hazard pay. They won't do that either.
Okay, let me check and make sure we don't have any hands up. Not seeing any.
So I'll just finish with this. We'll probably get out a little bit early. I am encouraging people to get as creative as they can between now and the end of the reimbursement claim period, which is, if you see the dialogue box, is absolutely and hard, fastly the 30th of December. I don't know what the state's plan is for excess money. If you guys recall, the state set aside about $300 million for local government CARES Act eligible expenses, and we're not going to hit $300 million. But I encourage your creativity with the understanding that it's still Jason and I that are going into that room, and they have to be, plausible and nexus to COVID-19 related expenses. We will advocate for anything you tell us to advocate for bringing forward. And I think we've seen a little bit of relaxing in consideration of what probably 3 or 4 months ago would not have been eligible expenses that the state's looking differently on. And that in large part is thanks to you guys coming up with really good justifications for why requests for purchases and equipment have a nexus to COVID-19. Keep doing that, but keep doing that with understanding that it is us in the room and have to, with a straight face, make these allocation requests and get pre-authorization for things that might not otherwise have been approved.
Technology is one, in addition to ambulances, that we continue to have really good success with. So laptops for folks you might have to send home if COVID hits your courthouse. Any kind of additional security you need for remote workers. Some of those items become fairly large costs for the larger counties especially.
Jason, here's a question. It says, my recent request that they are denying is work comp. Is that something that should be granted?
So the benefit, or they're actually not working because they're on a work comp claim?
It's the benefit that they're denying.
Really?
Yeah. Well, they did it halfway. On my previous request for that they denied all my benefits, they're including it there, but on my latest salary request, they're denying work comp for all of my people. They did it half-half, I guess.
Jason, that's new, right?
Huh?
That's new.
That should be covered. Yeah. Who was that was talking?
Amy from Flathead County.
Amy, I will follow up.
Okay, I'll push back. I haven't submitted my responses, so I was planning on pushing back on it.
It's on the list of eligible benefits, and they have the only eligible benefit that they have said no to at this point that I'm aware of is leave.
Okay. Commissioner McGinley, did you have a comment on that?
No, that just our request when we resubmitted, they did pay our workers' comp, so.
So a couple of things you guys need to know. They have about 100 million in requests this time. The DOA staff is also, they had 40-hour jobs before, and this has been dumped in their lap. And I can tell you that we're getting emails from them at midnight. So they're overwhelmed. They're trying to hire temporary staff. So some of it, if depending on where your request lands, if it ends up with a temporary staffer that hasn't been part of this since the beginning, we may have to say, hey, you messed up and ask for a correction. So if you guys think something should have been approved and it wasn't, please reach out to me. And it might be just an internal training thing that we need to alert them to tell their staff that they've denied something they shouldn't have. I hope that's the case for you, Amy.
Do you have any updates on reimbursement for Department of Corrections cost reimbursement? Are detention centers still holding DOC inmates?
I think they're going to hold the final decision on that until the very end. I think they're worried about some long-term implications with state contracts with counties going forward. There's some rabbit holes that they don't want that to end up making us go down. But they have not said no, but want to find a better avenue or a better way of wording that reimbursement if they were to do it. So they have some pretty big concerns. It's a fairly big hurdle for us to jump because of long-term implications, but we're still working on them.
We have a couple of questions that have come in the chat box around elections, so we'll look at those. The first one, we received a check from the state in September. When the treasurer technician called to ask what the check was for, the check was for mailing of primary election ballots. We did not request this funding through the CARES Act reimbursement program, but we also did not request it separately. Is it like unsolicited funds? It is like unsolicited funds. It seems like CARES Act funding. Have you heard of any other counties receiving such money?
Yes. So it's not coming from the local government piece of CARES. It's coming out of, Eric, do you know where that's coming out of?
Yeah, so it intentionally, it comes out of the state share of CARES, not the local government partition portion of it. And the state sent that money out so you wouldn't get, they wouldn't see double requests for reimbursement of that through the local government portion of CARES Act funding. The theory was both in the primary election where there was going to be a cost saving. So originally the state said they didn't want to pay for any costs associated with the primary election, but then conceded in the general election, if you convert to all mail, that there would be some advertising costs and things like that that might be reimbursable. But postage was the impetus behind that last check as it came back to the counties in essence. There's a question on the chat box that is sort of directly related to this, and that is, if a county engaged in some outreach or educational effort in this election that was specifically related to COVID-19, changes in operations, new polling places, changes in polling places, or just noticed that the election was going to be conducted all by mail or in some different format, the question was, are those CARES Act eligible? And I believe absolutely they are. So if you received the denial for outreach and education in terms of your election communications, let us know, and I'd like to take those back for a second look.
I just want to interject for a minute. The Secretary of State's office is also handling HAVA funds from the CARES Act when it passed. The CARES Act passed with $400 million in funding for elections, and then that got distributed out to the states. Montana got its usual at 3.1 million. So the Secretary of State is doing grants for election costs, and I believe that you can submit for reimbursement afterwards. There is a match for that though.
And I think there's some private grants out there too. I think Prairie County got a private grant. So you just have to sort of, I'm looking at the chat. And for those of you that aren't reading the chat, I just want to be very clear. The deadline is December 30th. We're not forgetting there's 31 days in December. We know there's 31 days in December. The legislation says December 30th. So that is not we're not misspeaking when we say that.
And we have another elections related question here that maybe wasn't covered. Our elections office did a letter for the primary to all registered voters stating that we were doing mail ballot due to COVID, and they are denying that request. Is that something we can challenge? So I guess, and that goes back to, should that be submitted through the local governments as part of the CARES reimbursement or CARES funding?
Yes, it should. And that is something that I'd absolutely advocate for. That is outreach and education directly related to the pandemic and a change in your operations. It should be reimbursed.
Yeah, send us the information and the cost.
What else we missed? So this comp time one, Amy, is this a follow-up? The comp time used has been denied. I understand that it was not time worked, but they did work the time during the period. So is there any way I can get that paid? So this sounds like they're asking about comp time used, not comp time in the benefits. Is that right?
So comp time is going to be treated the same as vacation time. So
which is not eligible. Okay.
Not eligible by state requirements.
How about, can CARES funding be used if a county needs to arrange for non-congregant sheltering? We may be renting hotel rooms and have a need for contracted security and more.
So before Jason answers that, I'm wondering if we can hear from Lewis and Clark and Missoula County. I think both of them have set up systems and received reimbursement. I know Lewis and Clark is on.
Actually, he may have just left. Was that Jim McCormick?
Andy's there.
Oh, Andy's here. Okay.
Yeah. So we have our part of our fairgrounds facility set aside. We have a facility set aside for if we have COVID outbreak in our detention facility. We have a couple of big tents that are, with heaters in them, that kind of thing, set up at the fairgrounds. And all of those we've held in reserve for that particular purpose. If a congregate living center has the virus go through it, or for other reasons, homeless or whatever it might be, if we need to use those, and those have all been reimbursable so far. We've been submitting reimbursement for those, and they've paid for us holding those in reserve, and overflow for the hospital as well at one of our fairground facilities. So all of that's been reimbursed thus far.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chris, I see you're on. Can you talk about your operations there for congregate and shelters?
Sure. So Missoula County as well has done that. However, non-congregate shelter is actually a FEMA eligible expense. So non-congregate shelter has to be submitted to FEMA first, but the state has agreed to pay the 25% that is not FEMA eligible, or the local match equivalent of it, through CARES Act reimbursement. So it is best to coordinate that if you can through your DES folks so that they can get that arranged.
So this is Jane Weber, and I asked the original question. So thank you, Chris. Our concern was it was going to get pretty expensive covering the 25%. So definitely the CARES can cover that 25% that's required from FEMA.
Commissioner, absolutely. And we had that clarified really early on, that anything that was FEMA eligible, we were either going to get the state to waive, the feds to waive, or confirm that CARES was eligible as a match. And that has been established at the beginning. And if you want, if you have a proposal, get it to Jason and I, and we'll get pre-authorization so you're not incurring a bunch of costs without knowing for sure that it's going to be 100% reimbursed.
Thank you.
Even if you're going to submit it to FEMA, because if the state says it's eligible and FEMA doesn't, they're going to pick up the tab.
Great, because we've got the FEMA application prepared, but we've been a little concerned about the reimbursement on the 25% match requirement. Thank you.
The one other thing I'd add is that FEMA has actually been extremely responsive. We've actually already been obligated for our first quarter CARES piece of that, and actually been reimbursed by FEMA. So that they've actually been more responsive. It's not a wait till everything is over process, which has been helpful also.
So anything related to homeless in the urban centers, or even in some of the other areas where you have homeless issues, if you have a plan or a proposal that you want us to take to them, we're happy to do that. They did express that they thought they would probably start to see some of that given the change in the weather. So I think they're anticipating it. If you need that sort of assistance and you've got a plan and you know what it's going to cost, we're happy to see if we can get that approved.
It seems to me, Chris, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Missoula even put in a proposal to do some cleanup and some temporary bathroom facilities for a homeless encampment that the state was able to come up with reimbursement for, right?
That's correct, Eric. We the Poverello Center, which is our homeless shelter, can only run at less capacity than it normally would, obviously, for that. So we've been able to provide some sanitation facilities and other things at other locations to allow for that. The state's actually been really good to work with on those issues. So,
a follow-up question on that same thread: does the FEMA funding for non-congregate also end on December 30th?
So actually, no, it's a 30-day approval period that they do, and it is extended right now through the presidential disaster declaration. It runs the length of that, which has been extended until, Eric, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, I believe right now it's January 22nd is the current proposed end date for the presidential disaster declaration. So it continues beyond CARES.
And politics will play a role in that, but I do expect that to be continued. What will end hard and fast is the match. You won't be able to get CARES match for that 25%, but I still think there's an option for the feds to waive that entirely, or the state to pick up that 25% match on behalf of the counties.
So this is Jane again. Eric, thank you, because that's going to get pretty expensive. We're looking at a hotel that's willing to dedicate an entire wing for us. And we're probably going to need security once we get up to 15 people using those rooms, and that's going to get expensive rather quickly.
Commissioner, there were discussions at the federal level. This goes back probably August, September, about FEMA officially waiving. They can do it. My understanding is by basically an administrative decision. And they held off on that because the CARES Act money was out in the public, and they basically just confirmed that it wasn't supplanting or inappropriate use of federal funds to match federal funds. Once the CARES Act money dries up, I do think there's going to be pressure on FEMA to waive that match for the situations you're talking about. We're not going to be out of the pandemic on December 30th, and there'll be pandemic-related costs that will be incurred. So I sort of expect FEMA to waive that when it comes time and the money dries up that's out there right now.
Thank you.
Here's another question from the chat box. We're getting requests that we find a way to provide housing for isolation to family units to prevent the spread through the whole family. How would this be classified to get reimbursed?
I'll take a stab at that. So, I mean, the justification is that you essentially have a quarantine order and you're separating people, and there's a cost incurred with that. It's a clear nexus to COVID, and I think it should be at least considered as an eligible expense. There's an aspect of reasonableness that the state talks about. You can't, there's nothing in writing, there's no guidelines for what reasonableness is, but they've been really open to just a dialogue to show a true nexus. So that seems to be a reasonable proposal as long as you're not putting them up in really expensive housing.
Yeah, Eric, this is Scott who asked the question from Lake County. We are getting pressure through the tribe and others saying, gee, we have 1% testing positive, but we now need to house the whole family separate from each other in a hotel.
If it's not a 5-star hotel, I'd say it's reasonable. And there's no dollar threshold on that. Jason, you can add to it, but the notion that a cost incurred for segregation and isolation is not COVID related, I think would be an easy one for you to win at the governor's office.
So I'd like to have a conversation with them about that. My concern is they may have some issues with what does that look like statewide if we open that door, and that's always been a consideration they have, whether an idea is good or not, is what sort of Pandora's box can be opened. So I would want to ask before we turn you loose, but beyond that, my bigger concern is you're only going to get reimbursed for your costs for the next 2 months on that, and then it goes away. So it's not a solution for you from a cost perspective that has any sort of tail on it that's helpful. Come January, you're going to be footing the bill for that yourself. So I'm wondering if there's some other sort of arrangement that could be made that we could do the expense up front and have it in place.
So let's talk about that, Jason. I don't want to put Custer County on the spot, but I'm going to put Custer County on the spot. They had a proposal for something that was short-term and itinerant to get through the end of December with CARES Act eligible expenses that they knew if they could buy a facility that could last them well through the winter. And they made the request to make an outright purchase instead of a leasing mobile structure for 2 months. And the purchase was approved because it was reasonable. And there was an acknowledgement that it would be used after the duration of the CARES Act eligibility. I think the same applies in this situation. Lewis and Clark talked about buying tents. Yellowstone County, I think, made some large purchases. I can't remember what Missoula County invested, but I think some of that was at least semi-permanent. So upfronting something like a plan for segregated housing or congregate living facilities that may or may not be FEMA eligible might be something you guys should consider instead of just getting what you can for 2 months. Take a bigger bite that might last longer.
I have been reluctant to put the county in a position where we might have to foot that bill. So I've been resistant to the county jumping on board with doing that, just because it will end December 30th.
Yeah, and that's my biggest concern for you, saying, yes, we're responsible for providing this quote unquote service, because there's no end in sight and it could end up getting real expensive for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
In the chat, we also have, looks like a comment from Keith Wilson. FEMA NCS is approved rolling 30 days. This period ends November 11th. The next approval period will be November 12th through December 11th. In Gallatin County, HRDC purchased a hotel. We've been leasing rooms with plans to submit FEMA NCS PW. Okay, I think that gets us caught up. So thank you guys for sharing your examples and experiences. I think that's helpful for others to hear. Do we have any other questions? We have just under 15 minutes left scheduled. We don't want to keep you here if we don't have to. Another comment came in. Jason and Eric, on behalf of Lewis and Clark County, thank you for all that you've done to advocate for our requests, especially the latest creative ones with the Governor's Budget Office. Your ongoing hard work is greatly appreciated.
You're welcome.
I'm getting a clap from Chris over there. Yep. Okay. All right. Let me do another run through. Make sure we don't have any hands up. Looking good. Okay. Any last minute questions? Now is the time. Otherwise, Jason, Eric, Dan, does anybody have anything that we want to sign off with?
Just my thanks and hang in there, everyone.
Yep. Stay safe.
And good luck with the election next week.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, I want to just extend my appreciation for everyone's participation and the questions. I think it's always a good dialogue that we have when we host these. If there are, it seems like the COVID and the reimbursement seems to occupy a lot of our discussions, and I think that's great, and I think it's appropriate. As time goes by, and as we start to wane on this immediate issues, if you would like to continue having this conversation, continue meeting a couple times a month, we could start thinking about different topics and other issues that might be playing on your minds that you might want to have this kind of a forum where we can talk amongst yourselves as well as with our center and with MACo. So this doesn't have to end with the COVID. If you think that this is of value, we may not need to do it every other week, maybe once a month, but let us know if you think this is an outlet that is worthwhile. And if so, if there are certain topics you want us to address, we can start considering that and maybe incorporating some other topics into these conversations when we start declining on the questions around COVID and the reimbursement in the CARES Act program. Go ahead, Eric.
Dan, that reminded me, and I'm sorry for jumping in, but I did want to announce to the membership that we're, given COVID and what's going on, we're modifying our elected official training. What normally we would do is invite all elected officials to Helena for the first part of December. We're going to do a road show. So we're planning on getting out into your communities and encouraging all elected officials to come to those 4 different locations that we set across the state in the first 2 weeks of December. Dan is going to travel with us, and we're going to do a modified version of that 3-day curriculum in roughly 8.5 to 9 hours at each location. So we'll be in Glasgow, Forsyth, Boulder, and Choteau, and those dates will be coming out pretty soon. We're just getting the final confirmation in those home cities that will allow us to come and put on elected official training out in your guys' neck of the woods.
And yeah, we would appreciate your attendance, your peers as well as the newly elected folks. So it'd be great if everybody could show up there at that time. We'll try to make sure it's socially distanced and we're being appropriate in the delivery of that. Great. Well, if there's nothing else, Ashley, we good for any other questions? The rest are just comments and references to us.
Yep, that's what I'm seeing.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Stay safe, and we will connect again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
November 13th should be our next meeting.